The vial slipped from her fingers and shattered on the stone floor, and Lena barely noticed, because the man bleeding out 3 feet away was already past the point where broken glass mattered. She was not supposed to be in the war room. The royal physicians had evacuated when the northern pass collapsed, and Kyle Voss's raiding wolves broke through the second gate, and the 2 guards who'd stayed at their posts were now fighting in the courtyard below. She could hear them through the arrow slits, the snarling, the crunch of bodies against stone. She was a field herbalist. That was her designation, her only designation. The one thing the Duskfen pack had permitted her to be after 7 years of being permitted nothing else. She gathered roots and dried leaves and ground powders that the real healers used without ever asking where they came from. She was not a physician. She had no business crouching over a dying Alpha King on a blood-soaked war table while a battle raged outside his walls, but the physicians had fled, and no one else was coming, and Alpha King Darren Voss was going to die on a map of his own territory if she didn't do something. She assessed fast, the way you learn to assess when years of low-rank survival have taught you that hesitation is a luxury. 2 deep lacerations across his left side, one lower, angling toward his abdomen. A puncture wound above his hip she didn't like the look of. His breathing was shallow and too fast. His skin had gone the color of winter ash under his tan. Her field kit was on her belt. It was always on her belt. She'd grabbed it when the first explosion went off, the way another person grabs their child, by reflex, because it was the only thing she owned that was truly hers. She had dried yarrow for bleeding, gold and thread paste that would hold against infection, suture thread and curved needles in a waterproof case that had never once let her down. The suture thread was wrong. She knew it before she opened the case. Standard thread for wounds this deep on a shifter would reject within hours, the body treating it as foreign, pushing it out, reopening everything. She'd seen it happen. She'd cleaned up after it happened. Shifter tissue needed something organic, something living, something the body would recognize as kindred. Her gaze went to her braid. It fell over her shoulder as she leaned forward, nearly brushing the king's wound, dark brown, almost black, worn in the same tight plait she'd kept for 5 years, since the night she'd had her failed shifting ceremony, since the night Aldrich, the Duskfen packmaster, had declared her wolf dormant and assigned her to the herbalist quarters. She'd started braiding it the next morning because she needed something in her life she could control. She'd never cut it. She cut it now. Drew her field knife, pressed it to the plate close to the nape of her neck, and sawed through. 4 inches of hair fell into her palm. She got to work immediately, splitting the braid into individual strands, twisting them together the way she twisted dried fiber for poultices, tight and even, testing the tension between her thumb and forefinger. Stronger than she expected. Her hair had always been like that, too thick, too dense, impossible to break cleanly. The other Omegas in Duskfen used to say the only resilient thing about her was her hair. She threaded her smallest curved needle. The first pass into the king's flesh was careful, measured. She had sutured before, on wolves who came back from border skirmishes half dead and didn't want to wait for the physicians, on livestock, on herself once when a root cellar shelf had collapsed and there was no one else to do it. She knew how to keep her hands still when everything else was noise. The king's eyes opened. She did not stop. She couldn't stop. The blood was still moving, slower now but steady, and the gray at the edges of his skin had not retreated yet. She placed the second stitch without looking up. His eyes were not what she expected. She'd seen him from a distance before. Every low-rank wolf in the territory had, because you learned to know what the most dangerous person in the room looked like from as far away as possible. She'd expected brown or black, something cold and impersonal. What she got was amber. Deep reddish amber, like firelight trapped in glass, and they fixed on her face with an intensity that made her needle hand want to shake. She didn't let it. Something happened at the third stitch. Not dramatic, not electric, nothing like what the old stories described. It was more like pressure, a warmth that started at the pads of her fingers and moved inward, spreading up through her wrists, her forearms, settling behind her sternum with a weight that was almost ache. like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. She smelled pine smoke, not from the room, from him, from his skin, his blood, the wound itself. Something deep and resinous rising, as if the act of suturing was releasing something that had been sealed inside him. It made no sense. She filed it away and kept stitching. Her wolf stirred. She nearly dropped the needle then. Nearly. 5 years since her wolf had done anything other than lie like a stone at the bottom of a river, cold and still and silent. 5 years since Aldrich had stood at the front of the pack hole and said, in front of everyone, that she had no wolf worth counting, no shift worth waiting for, no rank worth assigning beyond the task rooms. She had been 20 years old. She had believed him, eventually, the way you believe a thing you were told often enough. But now, something moved in her. Slow. Rolling. Like something enormous turning over in its sleep, disturbed by a scent it recognized from a long time ago. She placed the 4th stitch. The 5th, the warmth deepened with each one, and her wolf pressed closer to the surface like a creature rising through dark water toward light it had almost forgotten. She was on the 8th stitch when the door opened. Armored boots, the sound of them, heavy and fast. She didn't turn. A voice she didn't recognize said, "What is that Omega doing?" Another voice, sharper, "Get her away from him, now." A hand closed on the back of her jacket and hauled her upward. A needle pulled free. A single bead of blood, hers, from where she'd pricked her own finger, dropped from her fingertip and landed on the king's chest. The skin beneath it glowed. A brief, warm amber pulse there and gone, like an ember catching. The room went silent. She thought, later, about that silence, how it had a different texture from ordinary silence, how even the 2 armored wolves, both of them larger than most men she'd stood near, had gone absolutely still. The king spoke. His voice was low, rough at the edges from blood loss and pain, but it carried. It always carried. She would learn. It was the kind of voice that filled a space completely without needing to rise. Put her down. The hand released her. She stumbled, caught herself on the edge of the table, and turned. 2 wolves in black armor were staring at the place on his chest where the light had been. Their faces held an expression she'd never seen aimed in her direction before. It took her a moment to identify it. Fear. Not of her, precisely. Of what had happened when her blood touched him. The king was pushing himself upright. The movement was wrong, too controlled for someone who had been dying 40 seconds ago. The sutures she placed were holding, and more than holding. She could see the tissue around them beginning to close, the wound edges drawing together around the hair thread, as if his body recognized it as something it had always meant to accept. "Come here," he said. She didn't move. She was holding her needle in one hand and her field knife in the other. And she was acutely aware that she was a low-rank herbalist with a half-finished suture job and a 4-inch braid cut off her own head, standing in a war room that was well above her station. Lena. She startled. She hadn't told him her name. He said it again, quiet, the way you say a word you already knew before you learned it. "Come here." She went. She went because her wolf was pulling her forward like a tide pulling water, and because her legs were already moving before her mind issued the instruction. She knelt beside him. That was what you did before now for King. You knelt. And her knees hit the stone and her hands were still trembling. Not from fear anymore, but from something else she had no name for yet. He took her hand, the left one. The one with an old scar across the palm she'd gotten 2 winters ago when Aldrich's second-in-command had shoved her into a rack of processing tools for mixing his order wrong. His fingers were larger than hers by a significant margin, calloused in the particular pattern of someone who had trained with a blade since childhood. And the moment his skin met hers, the warmth roared. Not metaphorically. She felt it physically. A surge that moved from their joined hands up through her arm and into her chest, where her wolf answered with a sound she felt in her ribs. Not quite a howl, more like a chord, like 2 notes sounding at once and discovering they were the same note. "Mate," he said, a simple word, a quiet word. It rearranged the room. No, she said. Her voice was remarkably steady given the circumstances. That's not. I don't have a wolf, I was declared. Whoever declared you was wrong. He said it without heat, without emphasis, the way a person states something they've already confirmed. His amber eyes were very focused on her face. Finish the sutures. One of the wolves behind her cleared his throat. My lord, the east wing has fallen. We need to move you to the lower hall. Darren didn't look away from her. She finishes. Then we move. She finished. 14 stitches total, each one sending that warmth deeper, each pull of the hair thread-weaving something between them that she could feel but couldn't name. By the 12th stitch, she could feel his heartbeat. By the 14th, it was syncing with hers. She didn't say anything about that. They moved into the lower hall with her walking beside him because he wouldn't release her hand, which was an experience so disorienting she spent most of the walk trying to figure out how to tactfully remove herself. She did not succeed at the tactful removal. The lower hall was warmer than the rest of the fortress, built around an interior hearth that burned even in summer. There were wolves already inside, wounded and tending to wounded, and every one of them turned when the king entered. She expected them to look at him. They looked at her, the pack healer, a solid woman named Holt with silver-streaked hair and the permanently unimpressed expression of someone who had seen too many things to be surprised by new ones, crossed the room and crouched beside the sutures. She touched the thread. She pulled her fingers back. This is bound, Holt said. She was talking to the king, but looking at Lena. Whatever she used, this isn't just holding the wound, it's holding the two of you. She looked at Lena more carefully. Do you know what you've done? I sutured the wound, Lena said. You used your own hair. I didn't have organic thread. Holt sat back on her heels and was quiet for a moment in a way that felt significant. 14 bonds, she said finally. Formed through suture thread made from the healer's own body, drawn through the flesh of an alpha. There are accounts of this in the old texts. Blood, alchemy, binding through craft. It was considered an extinct art. She looked up at the king. She didn't know what she was doing. I know, he said, and his voice held no distress, only the same quiet certainty it had held since he'd first opened his eyes in the war room. Lena was looking at the sutures, at the clean, even spacing, at the way the hair thread had darkened slightly against his skin, where the two of them had closed. 14 stitches, 14 threads of her hair, inside his body. How do we undo it? She said. The king looked at her. Holt looked at her. The 2 armored wolves near the door looked at her. Nobody answered. She learned his name from the other wolves. Darren Voss, Alpha King of the Eastern Territories, Lord of the Iron Veil Pact, the youngest Alpha to consolidate 3 pack alliances in 2 centuries. He was 33. He had led for a decade. He had never chosen a mate. That last piece of information was delivered to her 4 separate times by 4 separate wolves in the first hour, each time with a different degree of unsubtle implication. She stayed in the lower hall because Holt told her to, and because the bond, she'd started thinking of it as the bond by the end of the first night. Reluctant capitulation to the reality of the thing made distance physically uncomfortable. Not painful exactly. A pressure, like trying to breathe at high altitude. She could manage it, but she was aware of it constantly. On the second day, she found a corner of the hall with decent light and started going through the herbs she had left in her field kit. Taking stock. Organizing. Her hands needed something to do. Darren found her there. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps, he was too quiet for that, but a shift in the warmth behind her sternum, a deepening like the bond flexing. He sat down beside her. Not across the grain sacks she'd arranged into a workspace. Beside them, close enough that his knee brushed hers, and she felt the contact as warmth. "What are you doing?" he said. Not quite a question. "Inventory." She held up a small paper packet. "I'm low on golden thread. I'll need to restock when we reach somewhere with access to waterway plants. He watched her work. She was aware of him watching, aware in a way that was different from the usual awareness of being observed by someone with authority over you. The defensive, contracted, make-yourself-small awareness she'd lived in for 7 years. This was different. This felt like being read. Carefully, without urgency. "You're very focused," he said. "I'm always focused when I'm working." "No," he said. "When most people take stock of supplies, they look like they're doing a chore. You look like you're doing something that matters." She stopped with her hands in the kit and thought about that. "It does matter," she said finally. "Someone might need this tonight. The right herb at the right dose is the difference between a fever breaking or not." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you know about binding plants?" he said. She looked at him. "That's a fairly specific question." Holt said the bond you made through the sutures has properties she associates with certain old blood herbalist lines. She used the phrase bloodcraft. He paused. "Your hands don't shake when you work, even now. I was taught early that shaking hands cost lives." "Who taught you?" "No one formally. I taught myself." Something moved across his face. "Lena, why did Duskfin Pack mark you dormant?" It was a strange question to ask directly, without preamble. Most people avoided it, the way people avoid asking directly about scars. "Because I didn't shift on my ceremony night," she said. "Did they test for other manifestations?" "They're tested for shift. That's the only test they do." He was looking at her with that amber gaze again, steady and measuring. "Holt thinks the binding you created through the sutures isn't a wolf gift," he said. "She thinks it's older than that. Pre-shift. Something that operates below the wolf." She didn't say anything. The kit was open in her hands and she was looking at the golden thread packet without seeing it. "There are lineages," he continued, "from before the pack system organized. Healers who could work bonds through craft, physical materials. Touch. They were called weavers in the old records." He paused again. "The last recorded weaver bloodline disappeared about 200 years ago. The histories say they were hunted." "Why?" she said. Her voice came out even. "Because they could bind any wolf, any alpha, not through force, through care. The pack hierarchy depends on the assumption that rank is absolute. A weaver who could form bonds through healing disrupted that assumption." He looked at the sutures on his side. 14 bonds, Lena. Holt has treated bound mates for 20 years. She has never seen more than 3. The lower hall was loud around them. Wolves moving, voices low, the crackle of the fire. She sat in the middle of it and thought about her hair, about why she'd never been able to break it, about why her golden thread paste worked better than the formulations the palace physicians used, about the frost she'd found on her fingers one morning 3 years ago that she'd never been able to explain. "What does it mean?" she said. "Practically," he said, "it means you are not an Omega with a dormant wolf. It means Duskfin's assessment of you was wrong, and it means that 14 bonds link your life force to mine, which means I have a significant personal interest in ensuring nothing happens to you. That's very transactional." The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes," he said, "it is. Are you all right with that framing for now?" She looked at him. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was not all right with very much that had happened in the last 2 days, and she was also, somehow, more all right than she'd been in years. "For now," she said. The raid ended on the 3rd day. Kale's wolves retreated into the eastern wastes and the fortress stood intact. They began the journey to the Ironvale capital 2 days later. A column of warriors and supply wagons and one herbalist who had never left the Duskfin border territories and was now, apparently, the Alpha King's mate. She traveled in a supply wagon. He offered her a place in the main column 3 times. She declined 3 times. The wagon suited her. She could think in the wagon. The capital was built on a plateau above the river junction, the kind of geography that had been strategic for 200 years and was now simply beautiful. White stone and dark timber, towers at the 4 compass points, terrace gardens visible from the valley road below. She had heard descriptions of it. The descriptions were insufficient. She was still wearing her field clothes when they arrived. She'd rinsed them in streams during the journey, but she had nothing else, and she was too self-sufficient to ask for what she didn't have. She climbed down from the wagon at the base of the main road and stood looking up at the slope of the city and thought, with perfect irrelevance, that she would need to find out what plants grew in this elevation before she could restock properly. Darren appeared beside her in the way he did, quiet and sudden, close enough that the bond hummed. "I don't have anything to change into," she said before he could speak. "That can be resolved," he said. She was given rooms, more than she'd ever occupied in her life, a sleeping chamber with windows facing the river, a preparation room with an enclosed hearth, a bathing room with stone fixtures, and a workroom. The workroom occupied the northern corner of the suite, and it stopped her in the doorway. The light was extraordinary. The ceiling was high and fitted with north-facing clerestory windows, the kind that caught cool, even light without direct sun. Exactly the right conditions for working with light-sensitive plant materials. The walls were lined with open shelving. Every shelf was stocked, dried herbs bundled and labeled in a hand she didn't recognize. Stoppered glass bottles of oil infusions and tinctures. Mortars and pestles in 3 sizes. A long work table with a stone top, cool to the touch, ideal for paste work. Drawers along the base that she opened one by one. Paper, fine mesh for straining, bone needles, suture thread in 4 gauges, and a small case of curved needles finer than anything she'd owned. She stood at the work table and didn't speak. She heard him behind her. The bond told her before her ears did. That low, warm pressure that meant he was close. She turned. He was standing in the doorway, and for the first time since the war room, she could see him clearly, without emergency, without blood. He was taller than she'd registered. His shoulders carried an architecture of someone trained from childhood to expect weight. His amber eyes were watching her with that same focused attention, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before. He looked like he was waiting for a verdict. "The golden thread is a different species than what I use," she said. "Southern cultivar, higher tannin content, better for blood applications. I can source whatever strain you prefer. Where did you get the curved needles? I described your kit to my supply master from memory." He sourced the closest equivalents he could find. She looked at him for a long time. Why? He crossed the room and stopped at the work table with 3 feet between them, and she noticed that he always stopped at exactly that distance, close enough that the bond was comfortable and far enough that the choice was hers. "Because you walked into a war room with a field kit and a steady hand," he said, "and you used the only thing you had to keep me alive, and the only thing you had was yourself." He paused. "This room is not a gift. It's a return." She was going to say something practical. She had a very practical nature. It had kept her alive, and she was going to say something about the golden thread strain or the suture thread gauges. Instead, she said, quietly, "I haven't had a room like this before." "I know," he said. His voice was the same as always, low and level, but there was something underneath it that she was beginning to recognize. The same thing she'd heard when he asked if the room was enough without quite asking it. The Alpha King of the Eastern Territories, who had consolidated 3 pack alliances and held them through force of will in 2 wars, was not entirely certain how to offer someone something without it looking like a command. She turned back to the shelves and ran her fingers along a row of bottles. "The tinctures are good quality," she said. "Whoever prepared these knew what they were doing." Holt supervised. "I'll need to add several compounds she wouldn't have thought to stock. Tell my supply master. I'll make a list." "Good." She heard him cross to the door. She heard him stop. "Lena, the 14 bonds. They don't make you a prisoner. They never will." His voice was careful, exact. "But they do mean that where you go, I will follow, and I would rather do that as something other than a shadow." She turned around. He was in the doorway, backlit by the hallway lamps, his face half in shadow. The sutures she'd placed were under his shirt, healed now beyond what they should have been. and she could feel them through the bond like a faint reciprocal pressure. 14 points of connection mapped across the space between them. "Ask me a real question," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Will you stay?" She thought about her field kit and her braid, and the 7 years of small, invisible, careful living she'd built in the Duskfen herbalist quarters. She thought about the golden thread on these shelves, the southern cultivar with the higher tannin content, and the curved needles her hands had already decided they wanted to use. "I'll stay," she said. "For now." The corner of his mouth moved again. She was beginning to catalogue that expression. "I'll take for now," he said, and left her to her workroom. The court existed. This was the principal thing she understood in her first week in the capital, that a structure of observation and assessment surrounded everything she did, and it never slept. The wolves she met ranged from genuinely warm to carefully neutral to politely hostile, and the politely hostile ones were the most work to navigate because their weapons were social and required paying attention to subtext. Cult found her on the 3rd day and sat her down in the infirmary and told her plainly what she needed to know. "There's a faction that wanted the king mated to a Thornwall blood wolf," Holt said. "Lord Kane has been managing that campaign for 2 years. He has 4 seats on the lower council. He won't move against you directly. Darren would end that immediately. But he'll work the perimeter, undermine the bond's legitimacy, question your bloodline." "What bloodline?" Lena said. "I'm from Duskfen." Holt looked at her steadily. "Are you?" Lena stopped. "I've been looking at the bond," Holt said. "Not the sutures. The bond itself. The way it behaves. The warmth it carries. The way it's accelerating his healing at a rate that isn't consistent with a standard mate bond." She set her hands flat on the infirmary table. "There are 14 bonds between you, formed through healing craft, through materials made from your own body, through intention even if you didn't know you had it. That is not wolf work, Lena. The wolves I know can't do this. The wolves I've ever known couldn't do this." She paused. "Who was your mother?" "She died when I was 7, Lena said. "She was a traveling herbalist. She brought me to Duskfen and arranged my placement with the pack before she died. I never knew why she chose Duskfen specifically." Holt was quiet for a long moment. "There are stories," she said, "about a healer bloodline that predated the pack consolidation. They were called weavers. They worked with organic bonds, materials from their own bodies, hair and blood and fiber, as conduits for living connections. They could bind wounds, and sometimes the people around wounds." She looked at the infirmary door, then back. "They were systematically eliminated about 2 centuries ago by a coalition of high-ranking alphas who believed their power was incompatible with rank hierarchy. The histories say the line ended." She met Lena's eyes. "The histories are apparently wrong." The infirmary was warm. Lena sat in it and thought about frost on her fingers on cold mornings, and about gold thread that worked better in her hands than in anyone else's, and about a braid that had never once broken cleanly, no matter how much she'd tried to snap a strand. "How many people know?" she said. "Darren. Me. Anyone who's looked closely at the bond." Holt paused. "Lord Kane." "How long has Kane known?" "Long enough. His family was involved in the original elimination." She said it without inflection. "He will have updated his information when the bond formed." Lena looked at her hands. "What do you recommend?" Holt said, "I recommend you figure out what you are before someone else defines it for you." She did not go directly to Darren. She went to her workroom, because the workroom was where her hands knew what to do, and when her hands knew what to do, her mind could think clearly. She stood at the stone work table and began to work with the gold thread tincture, adjusting the ratio by feel, the way she'd always done, the way she'd always felt faintly embarrassed about, because real herbalists used measured formulations, and she went by something that was not quite instinct and not quite knowledge. She watched her hands. The tincture deepened correctly under her fingers. The compound she'd been adjusting for 20 minutes was better than any formulation in the shelf bottles by a standard she couldn't quantify but could feel. She was not mixing with craft. She was mixing with something older than craft. She understood that now in the flat, factual way she understood most things that were difficult. She started a list. Not the supply list for the master. Her own list. Everything she'd ever done that couldn't be fully explained by training or habit. The frost on her fingers. The way her golden thread preparations worked faster than they should. The hair that wouldn't break. The bond she'd built without knowing bonds could be built. The list was longer than she expected. She was still looking at it when Darren appeared in the workroom doorway. She hadn't heard him. She'd felt him, the bond warming, the air shifting, and looked up before he spoke. "Holt told you," she said. "Holt told me she was going to tell you," he said. "There's a difference." She folded the list. Kane's family was involved in eliminating the Weaver bloodline. "Yes. And he's on your council." "He was on my council before I knew what you were." "What am I?" she said. He crossed the room and stopped at his habitual 3-foot distance and looked at her with those amber eyes, steady, as though the answer were already known and only needed to be said aloud. "You're the last of something the world tried to extinguish," he said. "And you're mine. Those two facts are now inseparable, which means everything that comes for one comes for the other." She thought about that. She thought about her mother, a traveling herbalist who had specifically placed her 7-year-old daughter with a backwater pack known for keeping its records poorly and its members invisible, who had died before explaining why. She thought she understood now why. "Kane will move," she said. "He already has." 2 of his council allies submitted a formal challenge to the bond's validity this morning. They're citing bloodline obscurity. He paused. "I've seen the challenge. My legal answer is straightforward. The bond exists, it's 14-fold, and its validity doesn't require bloodline documentation. But that answer works in the council chamber. It doesn't end the problem." "What ends the problem?" "You do," he said. "When you're ready." She turned back to the work table. The tincture was settled, perfect, the color it should be. She picked up the list she'd written and held it. "I'm not ready," she said. "I know." He paused. "I'm not asking you to be." She turned around. "But Kane has reached out to someone outside the territory. I don't know yet who. I'm working on finding out." His jaw tightened, very slightly. "There are older interests still active in some of the bloodline territories. Families who maintained their positions specifically by ensuring certain lines couldn't resurface." "Like Weavers?" "Yes." She thought about her mother again, about the choosing of Duskfin, about the specific, deliberate invisibility of the placement. "My mother knew," she said. "She wasn't hiding me from myself. She was hiding me from them." He was very still. "Yes," he said. "I think so. How long do we have?" "Weeks, maybe less." She set down the tincture and set down the list and picked up her smallest curved needle and turned it between her fingers, a habit she'd had since she was 12 and learning suture technique on leather scraps. "Then I have work to do," she said. She worked. The court continued to exist, and she moved through it, and she paid attention in the particular way she'd always paid attention to systems she was trying to understand. She learned names and positions and the architecture of who deferred to whom and why. She met Lord Kane at a formal dinner and shook his hand and read in 2 seconds the thing he was trying to hide beneath his courtesy. He was frightened. Not of her. Not yet. Of what she represented. Of the fact that something his family had considered settled for 200 years had apparently not settled at all. She filed that away. She found Darren's military advisor, a woman named Aldous who wore her silver hair cropped and her opinions close, and they discovered inside of one conversation that they had the same framework for assessing threats, which was, trace the resource. Find what someone stands to lose and you understand everything about why they'll act. Kane stood to lose his council position if the Weaver bloodline was acknowledged and its historical elimination was re-examined. His family name was attached to that history. Whatever external contact he'd reached out to stood to lose something larger, the certainty that a certain kind of power couldn't resurface. She told Darren at the end of the second week. She told him everything. What she'd worked out about Kane's position, about the external contact, about what she thought the timeline was. He listened without interrupting. He always listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "How do you want to handle it?" She'd expected strategy from him. Counter moves. The chess of it. She had not expected that question. "I want to call the challenge directly," she said. "Not through the council, not through legal channels, in the hall, pack law." He was quiet for a moment. "That requires you to speak to your bloodline." "I know." "You'll have to demonstrate it." "I know." "I can't. I know you can't be the one to validate it," she said. "It has to come from me." She looked at him. "I've been a backroom herbalist for 7 years. I know how to work in the periphery, but the periphery isn't safe anymore." She paused. "I'd rather be visible on my own terms than discovered on someone else's." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "When?" 2 days. Can Aldous have Kane's external contact identified by then? "I'll ask her tonight." Aldous had the name in 18 hours. The external contact was a representative of a Thornwall bloodline family with 2-century-old documentation of participation in the Weaver hunts. Darren had the representative escorted out of the territory before dawn, cleanly, without incident, without Kane knowing until morning. Kane came to her workroom. She had expected that too. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with the controlled bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime in rooms where power was decided. He looked at her workspace with the assessing gaze of someone pricing things. He looked at her with the same gaze. "You're more informed than I expected," he said, "for someone who grew up in Duskfen." "I grew up in Duskfen," she said. "I observed things. I learned things. That's not specific to a location." She set down the mortar she'd been working with. "Your contact left the territory this morning. The mask he wore didn't slip, but something behind his eyes recalculated." "I see. You submitted a challenge to the bond's legitimacy," she said. "You have that right. The council has that right. I'm not going to tell you to withdraw it." He waited. "I'm going to answer it," she said. 2 days. Formal hall. You can bring whatever documentation you think is relevant to bloodline questions." She paused. "So will I." He looked at her for a long moment. She saw, behind the courtly surface, the same frightened thing she'd seen at the dinner. He was not a cruel man, she thought. He was a man who had inherited a position that required him to be afraid of a particular thing, and had organized his life around that fear. She understood that. She had spent 7 years organized around fear. "You're not what Duskren thought you were," he said finally. "No," she said. "I'm not." He left. She picked up the mortar again. Her hands were steady. The formal hall 2 days later was full. The entire pack, or close to it, and council members in their designated positions, and Darren at the head of the room in the chair that had been his for 10 years. She walked in without announcement. She was wearing the dress she'd altered on her second day in the capital, deep green wool she'd taken in at every seam until it fit the way things she made always fit, exactly right. Her hair was shorter than it had been. It curled around her jaw now, growing back in soft waves she hadn't expected. She stood in front of the council table and looked at Lord Kane. "The challenge to the bond's validity," she said. "I'm answering it." She reached into the leather case she'd carried in and set on the table a series of prepared samples, 3 of her golden thread formulations at different stages, a swatch of suture work she'd done on a leather backing, and a small glass bottle of a compound that glowed faintly warm when she held it, not from any external source, from something internal, something that moved through her hands when she worked. She explained what each one was. She used plain language. She did not dramatize. Then she said, 14 bonds, formed through healing craft on the night of the Kale raid. Holt has documented each one. They exist independently of declaration. They're not a matter of ceremony or bloodline acknowledgement. They're a fact. She looked at the council. I am not asking you to acknowledge a bloodline. I'm asking you to acknowledge what already exists. The bond is real. I am the king's mate. Those two things were true before this hall, and they'll be true after it. She looked at Cain last. Your challenge is noted. My answer is in front of you. The hall was quiet. Darren rose from his chair. He had said nothing until now, per pack law, because the challenge was to her and the answer had to come from her. But he rose now, and the room oriented to him the way rooms always did, and he crossed the floor and stood beside her. He did not speak to the council. He spoke to her. You told me 2 weeks ago that you'd stay for now, he said. His voice was low. The room was quiet enough that it carried anyway. Is that still accurate? She looked at him. The amber eyes, the suture scars she'd placed under his shirt, 14 points she could feel through the bond like a map of where this had started. No, she said. Something shifted in his expression very fast, and she saw for just a moment what it looked like when an alpha king of 10 years standing was not entirely certain of an outcome. It's not for now anymore, she said. It's just, yes. The shift resolved. The something in his expression settled into a warmth she had been cataloguing for 2 weeks and had been unable to name until this moment. He reached into his jacket and drew out the case she'd given him on the evening after the council meeting, the one with the compound that glowed. He'd been carrying it. The case was worn at the hinge from handling. Then I have something for you in return, he said. He opened the case. Inside was a suture set, her needle gauges, her thread types, her specifications, rendered in materials finer than she'd ever owned, bone needles and braided organic thread in a fitted case that had been made to match her kit exactly. For the next wound that needs stitching, he said, whoever it belongs to. She took the case. She ran her thumb along the hinge. You'll need to source the golden thread from the northern cultivar, she said. Higher tannin. Better for blood applications. I know, he said. I asked Holt. The hall was still quiet. The council was watching. Cain was watching. 14 bonds hummed between her and the man beside her, warm and certain. The way things are when they were always going to be true, and were simply waiting for the moment to become undeniable. She closed the case. She had stitched him together in a war room with a needle and her own hair, not knowing what she was making. She understood now that the craft had always known even when the crafter hadn't. The bond had been real from the first stitch. The rest, the hall, the council, the green dress, the workroom full of southern golden thread, was just catching up to something already finished. She pressed her shoulder against his. He pressed back. Outside the hall, the river moved at the base of the plateau, cold and constant. In the capital's terraced gardens, the early autumn herbs were going to seed. She would need to check which ones were worth collecting. She would need to document the local cultivars and establish what was missing from her stocks. She had work to do. She had a workroom to do it in. She had 14 bonds, and a man who carried her medicine case against his ribs in a pack that was still deciding how to understand her, and a history 2 centuries old that was not finished yet. She had always been good at work that wasn't finished yet. She opened her kit on the council table, took out a needle, and got started.